The message Margaret saw changed everything. "When are you finally going to tell her about us?" Those words replayed in her mind over and over again. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't forget them. Who had sent the message? And what exactly did they mean? Margaret wanted to believe there was a reasonable explanation. She wanted to believe David was the honest, caring man she had come to know. But the more she thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the questions. Then she remembered something else. The phone call. The sudden change in David's expression. The way he immediately rejected it. The way he insisted it was nothing important. At the time, she believed him. Now she wasn't so sure. For the first time since meeting David, doubt had entered the relationship. And once doubt finds its way in, it rarely leaves quietly. What Margaret didn't know was that the answer she was searching for was already moving closer. And very soon, she would discover that the message was only the beginning. As the days passed, Margaret found herself watching David more closely. She didn't want to be suspicious, but the message had planted a question she couldn't ignore. At first, the changes were subtle. David took longer to return her calls. His messages became shorter. The easy conversations they once shared seemed different somehow. Then he started canceling plans. A lunch they had arranged days earlier was suddenly postponed. An evening walk never happened. A weekend outing was called off at the last minute. Each time, David apologized and offered a vague explanation, but he never gave details. Then there were the unexpected departures. In the middle of conversations, he would check his phone and leave abruptly. Sometimes he seemed distracted even when they were together. Margaret tried to tell herself she was overthinking things. Yet deep down, she felt the distance growing. And with every canceled plan and every unexplained disappearance, the mystery surrounding David became harder to ignore. Margaret found herself facing a question she never expected to ask. Should she trust David? Or should she start looking for answers on her own? Part of her felt guilty for even considering it. David had been kind to her from the very beginning. He had been patient, thoughtful, and caring. But another part of her couldn't ignore the growing list of unanswered questions. One evening, after another canceled plan, Margaret opened her laptop. She searched for David online. Then she searched again and again. Social media profiles appeared, but there was surprisingly little information. No family photos. No personal updates. No signs of the life he claimed to have lived. The deeper she looked, the more unusual it seemed. How could someone leave so little behind? Margaret stared at the screen. Instead of finding answers, she had discovered something even more unsettling. Almost nothing. And sometimes, what you can't find can be just as troubling as what you can. Then David disappeared. One day passed without a phone call. Then another. No text messages. No explanation. Nothing. At first, Margaret tried not to worry. She told herself he was busy. She told herself there had to be a reasonable explanation. But as the hours turned into 2 full days, the silence became impossible to ignore. She checked her phone constantly. Every notification made her heart race. Every missed expectation left her feeling more disappointed. What hurt most wasn't the silence itself. It was the uncertainty. If David cared about her the way he claimed to, why hadn't he reached out? Why hadn't he taken 30 seconds to let her know he was okay? By the second evening, Margaret found herself sitting alone at her kitchen table, staring at a phone that never rang. The loneliness she thought she had left behind was beginning to return. And for the first time since meeting David, she started wondering if the message on his phone had been warning her all along. Then, just as Margaret was beginning to believe David might never call again, he returned. He showed up at her door carrying a bouquet of flowers. The moment Margaret opened the door, she could see the regret on his face. Before she could ask a single question, David apologized. He admitted disappearing for 2 days had been unfair. He told her she deserved better than silence. He told her he should have called. He should have explained. Then he said something Margaret would never forget. "You deserve someone who chooses you every day." The words hit her harder than she expected. David went on to tell her how much she valued their time together and how important she had become to him. There was sincerity in his voice, and for the first time in days, Margaret felt her doubts begin to fade. The frustration, The questions, the hurt, they didn't disappear completely. But as she looked at David standing there with flowers in his hands, she found herself wanting to believe him. And little by little, the trust that had been slipping away began to return. A few weeks later, David invited Margaret to dinner at a small restaurant she had always loved. The evening felt perfect. Soft music filled the room. Conversations blended into the background. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt completely at peace. As they talked and laughed, she found herself thinking about how much her life had changed since meeting David. Then David stood up. Margaret looked at him, confused. A moment later, he slowly lowered himself onto one knee. Tears immediately filled her eyes. The entire restaurant seemed to disappear around her. All she could see was David. All she could hear was his voice. He spoke about second chances, about finding someone when you least expect it, and about how much she meant to him. Then he asked the question Margaret never thought she would hear again. For a few seconds, she couldn't speak. Finally, through tears and a trembling smile, she gave her answer. Yes. And just like that, every doubt, every fear, and every unanswered question seemed to fade away, at least for a moment. And then it happened. Just moments after Margaret said yes, the restaurant doors suddenly flew open. The room fell quiet. Heads turned. A woman rushed inside, her eyes locked on David. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't confused. She looked desperate and angry. Margaret watched as the woman moved through the restaurant without hesitation, straight toward their table. David saw her coming. The color drained from his face. His entire body went still. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the woman stopped in front of them and pointed directly at him. How dare you propose to someone else? Margaret's heart nearly stopped. She looked at David, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But he couldn't. He simply stood there, pale and silent. The woman turned toward Margaret. Her voice shook as tears filled her eyes. Then she looked back at David. Tell her who I am. Margaret felt the room spinning around her. The man she had trusted. The man she had just agreed to marry. The man she believed she knew. Suddenly looked like a complete stranger.